All right, today we're going to talk about an entirely different type of design for an experiment. Now, up till now, we've talked about the simple experiment. We've talked about the multiple group experiment. And today we're going to talk about the factorial experiment or the two-factor design. In this lecture, we're going to talk a little bit about what that design is, and we're going to introduce the terms main effects. In particular, we're going to talk about simple main effects and overall main effects. In the next slide, in the next lecture, we're going to talk more about a particular kind of effect called an interaction effect that's unique to this factorial design. But let's begin by talking about what a factorial design is. To start with, let's review what we already know, which is we've talked about the simple experiment, an experiment in which you have only two groups, typically some kind of a treatment or a manipulation, and a control group, people who don't get that treatment or manipulation. And in this study, we're comparing two different means, the mean of the treatment and the mean of the control. And for this, we use a t-test. So you could think about t-test testing two means. Now, in a more complex version of this, the multiple group experiment, here's where we add either another kind of treatment. So in the last lecture, we talked about drug A, drug B, and a control group, but you could also add a second kind of control group. So an empty control group versus a placebo. And in fact, in the last lecture, we talked about reasons why you might think about including both of those. So you could measure what the placebo effect is. In the first group, in the first type, the simple experiment, we have two means, and so we use a t-test. Well, in this kind of experiment, we have a freaking lot of means, so we're going to use an f-test or an ANOVA. And so we got our first introduction to the ANOVA in the last lecture. So let's think about this in terms of the groups we're comparing. In a simple experiment, we have two groups. In a multiple group experiment, we're going to add this third group in here. So a third could be 4, 5, 6, 7. You could have a lot of groups in a multiple group experiment. Now I'd like to inject another layer of complexity by talking about a third type of study. This is the factorial study. Now the most basic type of factorial, the 2 by 2 factorial, is really just a combination of 4 different simple experiments using only half of the participants. So first of all, let me just briefly say this is called a 2 by 2 factorial because we have two levels of one variable, 1, 2, and two levels of another variable, 1, 2. So it's a 2 by 2 factorial. If we had 3 levels over here, like a placebo, this might have been either a 3 by 2 or a 2 by 3. Doesn't really matter which one's on top, which one's on the bottom. But it's a 2 by 2 factorial, and this is the only kind that we're going to look at when we talk about factorial designs. But you can know that there are 2 by 3, 2 by 4, 2 by 6 factorials. Okay, so let's take a look at what this factorial is actually doing. What I'm suggesting is that it combines 4 different simple experiments. So we can, for instance, in one study, we can look at what does a single dose of a treatment do versus a multiple dose of a treatment. So here, all the participants are getting treatments, but some of them are getting single doses, some of them are getting multiple doses. So one of the simple experiments contained within this factorial is multiple versus single dose of a treatment. But in this very same factorial study, we can also actually control, let's say they get a placebo pill. And here's what we get to look at people who get one dose, the single dose of a placebo versus a multiple dose of a placebo or a control. Now, in this exact same study, we can also take a look at what happens when you give people a single pill, one dose of a treatment, versus versus a single placebo. So one treatment, versus one placebo, both of them being single doses. And in the same study, we look at what happens with multiple doses. multiple real pills, real treatments, versus multiple placebos. So here we can see there are 4 different simple experiments within a single 2x2 factorial. And again, this one you could think of as being a multiple dose or multi-stage treatment versus a multi-stage placebo or control. Now from this single experiment, this factorial design, we are going to get from this 2x2, we're going to get 4 different simple main effects, or 2 pairs of simple main effects. So we'll get, for instance, the simple main effect of treatment in the multiple dose condition, the simple main effect of treatment versus control in the single dose, the simple main effect of dosage in the control, and the simple main effect of dosage in the treatment condition. Now, if you didn't get all that, don't worry. I'm going to come back and look at each one of those. So we get 4 different simple main effects, and we also get what's called an overall main effect. Now, when we average a treatment's effects, their simple effects, it lets you find the overall main effect, the average effect of varying one factor. So let's take a look. In this first one, we can take a look at the simple main effect of treatment within the multiple dose condition. In other words, when everyone is receiving multiple doses, what kind of a difference does it make if they get a real treatment versus a control? And here what we find is the real treatment gives them, let's say, a 5 on happiness. That's the example we used in the last slide. So a 5 on happiness versus multiple doses of a placebo give them a happiness level of 3. In other words, giving them the real treatment in the multiple dose condition increases their happiness by 2. Okay, let's take a look at the simple effect of treatment versus control in the single dose condition. Here we find that when we move from the placebo to a treatment, we are once again increasing people's happiness by 2. So the simple effect of treatment within the single dose condition is positive 2. You may need to rewind these just to go back and hear these phrases again, but it might be helpful to do that. Let's take a look now at this effect. I'm going to erase some of the stuff so we don't get too flustered over here. Okay, now we're looking at, and listen to how I say this, we're looking at the simple effect of dosage, because we're comparing single dose versus multiple dose. The simple effect of increasing dosage within the treatment condition. And when we increase dosage from single to multiple, what we end up seeing is an increase in happiness of +2. And lastly, we have here the simple effect of dosage within the control condition. So all of these people are in the control condition, and we're looking what happens when you increase dosage. And what we find is when you increase dosage from single to multiple, it increases happiness at +2. Now, as you can see, I've made all of these +2. This is just for simplicity's sake. But I want you to get an idea of what each of these simple effects actually look like. In a little bit, what we're going to do is we are going to talk about interaction effects. Because the third thing that you can find from a 2x2 factorial design is a unique kind of effect called an interaction effect. And this is what we get when we compare a factor's simple main effects. So if we have 2 different simple effects of dosage between the 2 different control and the treatment conditions, then we have an interaction. But we'll talk more about that in the next video.